The moment Ibrahim Traoré stepped toward the podium, time itself seemed to pause. The grand conference hall in Geneva, ornate, glittering with chandeliers and heavy with the arrogance of power, fell into a silence that didn't feel like respect. It was the silence of people waiting for something they believed they already understood. The silence of indifference. The kind that drips with centuries of entitlement. World leaders lounged in their seats like owners of a show they'd seen 100 times before. They shifted, checked their phones, whispered to aides. Their expressions said it all. Another African speech. Another polite plea for help. The theater of diplomacy at its most condescending. But the man who now approached the podium wasn't here to beg. He wasn't here to fit the script. Ibrahim Traoré's stride carried a quiet fire, measured, grounded, unshaken. His suit was simple. No excessive ceremony, no colorful symbolism to entertain cameras. Just a soldier turned statesman who had come not to perform, but to confront. His presence was magnetic, unsettling. The kind that made even those who mocked him feel the weight of their unease. As he gripped the podium, the microphone hissed and crackled. Translators adjusted their headsets. Cameras zoomed in. A few diplomats leaned forward, sensing, without yet knowing why, that something was about to break the routine. Then it happened. From the front row, a smirk turned into laughter. The voice came from none other than Donald Trump, leaned back in his chair, one hand gesturing toward the African delegation. His tone was that of a man who'd never been challenged in a room that big. "Let's be honest," Trump said, voice dripping with casual mockery. "We all know who's been keeping the lights on across that continent for decades." Laughter erupted, thin, cruel, the kind that hides behind diplomacy but smells of colonial arrogance. The French delegation smiled knowingly. The British looked down, pretending restraint. A few others laughed into their hands, pretending to cough. Cameras caught every twitch of every face. But Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He stood still, calm as a mountain before a storm. The laughter rose, peaked, and then died. The silence that followed was heavier than the chandeliers above them, and then he spoke. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried the kind of gravity that makes even the powerful feel small. "The lights you claim to have kept on," he said slowly, "were powered by uranium taken from our soil, lit by copper stripped from our mines, paid for with gold you declared worthless in our hands, but priceless in your vaults. You could feel the air shift." Heads turned. A few hands froze halfway to their glasses. The translators hesitated, almost reverently, before their voices began to echo his. Words in a dozen languages, the truth hung naked in the room. Unavoidable, undeniable. "We do not need you to keep our lights on," Traoré continued. His tone softened, but the softness made the words cut even deeper. "We need you to stop stealing." No one moved. No one breathed. The silence that followed wasn't diplomatic, it was holy. Within seconds, phones lit up. Journalists' fingers flew across screens. The clip traveled faster than any press release could contain. Across cables, satellites, and networks, it spread like lightning. From Geneva to Lagos, from New York to Nairobi, in Dar es Salaam, a student refreshed her feed, saw the clip, and gasped. She didn't scroll past, she hit share. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but recognition. Across Africa, millions did the same. The algorithm smelled electricity, pride, fury, truth, and fanned the flames. The moment exploded online, unstoppable. Our lights, our power, it began as a hashtag. Then a movement. Then a digital revolution. CNN and BBC scrambled. Producers yelled in hallways. Anchors fumbled their scripts. Teleprompters went blank. Cut to the clip, they demanded. In Ouagadougou, before the state broadcaster could even upload the segment, people were already in the streets, dancing, shouting, crying. Young men and women painted his words on walls. "We need you to stop stealing," the paint still dripping as they sang and chanted under the night sky. Taxi drivers in Kinshasa stopped mid-traffic, blasting the clip from their radios. Strangers hugged in the street. Tears mixed with laughter. History, real, raw history, had just been spoken and everyone knew it. In Paris, the African diaspora projected his speech onto the walls of buildings that once looked down on them. "We need you to stop stealing," glowed across the night in bold letters, like scripture. The numbers broke the internet's logic. 12 million posts in 90 minutes. Twitter's servers glitched. Facebook froze. TikTok's algorithm surrendered. Everywhere, people repeated his words, not as a quote, but as a vow. In Addis Ababa, 3 students replayed the clip until they could recite it from memory. In Cape Town, an elderly woman, who had lived through apartheid, watched it on her grandson's tablet, whispering, "I waited my whole life for this." Artists began sketching Traoré's face. Musicians sampled his voice. Poets turned his words into verses. Churches and mosques echoed his message. Dignity is not charity. Freedom is not permission. Meanwhile, panic spread through Western media rooms like fire through dry grass. Fox News tried to laugh it off. They lasted 4 minutes before their own viewers flooded the comments, demanding to see the full clip. The BBC tried to contextualize it. CNN called it an emotional response. But none of it mattered. The people had already seen the truth, uncut, unedited, undeniable. In Africa, journalists who had been ignored for decades suddenly became the world's primary sources. Their analysis was shared millions of times while Western pundits stuttered on air, their polished talking points sounding hollow against the roar of authenticity. The old playbook, control the narrative, shape the optics, contain the outrage, was obsolete. Because this time, the story didn't belong to them. It belonged to us. And while Western strategists scrambled to contain the damage, young Africans were documenting everything, turning Traoré's words into digital lessons, threading history into context, showing how generations of exploitation had dressed itself as aid and partnership. In a small village with patchy signal and dusty roads, a 12-year-old girl named Amina watched the clip on a cracked phone screen. Her heartbeat echoed the rhythm of his words. For the first time, she saw someone who looked like her uncles and brothers, standing in a room of global power and not apologizing. Her brother Kofi came over. Neighbors joined. Under the village's old baobab tree, they passed the phone around like sacred fire. "He spoke for us," Amina whispered. That night, as firelight flickered against her grandmother's weathered face, the old woman said quietly, "We prayed for this day." It was more than a speech. It was an awakening. The next day, in a marble room hidden from cameras, 6 African leaders gathered. No champagne, no press, just history unfolding behind closed doors. President Wayne Mensah of Ghana was the first to speak. "What you did today," he said to Traoré, "is what we've all wanted to do. But we lack the courage to say it out loud. One by one, they nodded. Leaders who had long walked the tightrope between resistance and compromise. Nigeria's president stood and extended his hand, gripping Traore's forearm in the old warrior's greeting, older than colonial borders, older than the flags they flew. "You reminded the world," he said, "that Africa's dignity is not negotiable." Meanwhile, in the next corridor, Western diplomats gathered in damage control panic. The French ambassador refreshed his feed in disbelief. The American delegate slumped in his chair, realizing that for the first time Africa had spoken, and the world had listened. Later that night, Traore's phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. He answered. The voice that came through was low, aged, deliberate. "Mr. President," it said. "This is Thabo Kuni." Traore sat up straight. Everyone in Africa knew the name. The strategist who had stood beside Mandela during South Africa's liberation. "What you did today," Kuni said, "was not just a response. It was a declaration." He paused. "Mandela once told me that our liberation would be complete only when we no longer needed permission to exist as equals. Today you fulfilled that prophecy." The line went silent for a moment. Then Kuni's voice returned, soft but firm. "Remember, young man, you stood where Lumumba stood, where Nkrumah stood, where Sankara stood. But unlike them, the world couldn't silence you. Technology has made truth immortal." Traore closed his eyes. He could feel the ancestors listening, the men and women who had fought, bled, and died so that someday someone could speak the truth in full daylight and not be shot for it. When the call ended, he sat alone in the dim light of his hotel room, the city outside unaware that history had just bent its spine toward justice. The next morning, as he returned to the summit hall to collect his papers, the atmosphere was transformed. The same room that had once dismissed him now buzzed with a strange respect and quiet fear. As he walked out, cameras followed. His steps were unhurried, his face unreadable. But every motion carried a message. Africa will no longer kneel. Outside, aides and young diplomats stood taller as he passed. They knew, they had witnessed it. The day the narrative shifted, from that moment on, Africa would not be spoken about. It would speak for itself. In living rooms from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, parents would tell their children about the day Ibrahim Traoré made the world listen. And though the systems of exploitation wouldn't vanish overnight, the foundation had cracked and light was pouring through. As his plane lifted from Geneva's runway, bound for the skies over Africa, Traoré looked out the window. Beneath him, clouds rolled like an ocean of white fire. He whispered the words his grandfather once told him beneath the baobab tree. "They will offer you a seat at their tables built from stolen wood and call it progress. But your duty is not to sit, it is to build your own. And that's what this moment became, a blueprint for the future, a generation that would no longer beg for respect, but demand it, a continent no longer defined by pity, but by power." Africa's voice had risen, and the world would never silence it again, because dignity, once spoken with truth, cannot be forgotten. So I ask you, what truth have you been too afraid to speak? This is Traoré versus America. Subscribe, because courage like this doesn't just change headlines, it changes history.